Welcome to the Society of Women Engineers, Prospect Research, Identifying Funders and Partners for Your Program webinar. My name is Hannah Eichler-George, and I work in the Fund Development Department for the Society. This webinar is designed to introduce prospect research and solicitation techniques for SWE sections, especially with a focus on their leadership. We're developing this resource especially for those who are new to fundraising activities or may not have a lot of experience in developing programs and case statements for their local SWE sections. This is the first in a three-part series. We will be focusing on case statement development today and funder prospecting and solicitation. The second webinar in the series focuses on program measurement, and the third and final webinar focuses on funder cultivation. Throughout this webinar, there are several objectives that we'll be working towards. We'll go over how to develop a case statement for your program and SWE section, learn how and where to find funders in your area, understand best practices in approaching a funder, and have some tips on tracking and organizing prospects and funders in order to increase institutional knowledge for your local SWE section. Currently, the focus of this webinar is SWE sections located in the United States. We will be going over how to approach private institutional funders, including corporations and foundations. Right now, we will not be focusing on approaching funders for government or public funds, and currently we have not focused this webinar on an international audience. However, in the future, we hope to develop more resources for our international affiliates around fundraising. Finally, all of this webinar is focused on the long-term proposal development for grant requests for your local section. An important distinction to make as we're entering this webinar is the difference between letters of inquiry and grant proposals. Frequently, when you approach corporate and foundation funders, the document that they want to receive from you is either a letter of inquiry or letter of introduction or a formal grant proposal. Letters of introduction don't make a formal request. They simply provide an overview of your programmatic outreach activities. Letters of inquiry ask how you might be able to submit a formal grant request, and grant requests are documents that provide detailed summary and goals around the activities that you seek to garner funds for from the institutional funder. Before we get into any prospecting or research around funders in your area, it's really important for you and your section to have a clear understanding of the case statement for your program. These are critical for any fundraising activity and are really the foundation upon which all of your outreach activities and partnership development and fundraising requests are built. Case statements should include the mission of your local SWE section, the history and background of your SWE section, a need statement, description of SWE section and activities, programs and goals, intended outcomes and impact of your programs, and a conclusion. Oftentimes, when you are developing a case statement, you may have a lot of institutional knowledge that you're aware of, but isn't immediately available or obvious to an external source that is unfamiliar with SWE or your local section. To that end, it's important to also provide context for your local SWE section within the larger work and breadth of the society at large. Attached to this webinar are a few resources that we'll go over at greater length shortly, including a template and a proposal sample from SWE-HQ. Within both of these documents, we provide an overview of the mission of SWE and the history and background of the society at large. This is helpful information that you are free to use and copy into your own case statements or proposals as you see fit. So let's go over each one of these items at greater detail. If your SWE section has a mission that's unique to the section, make sure that that is front and clear within any case statement that you develop. You'll also want to give a brief history of your SWE section. How long have you existed? What key partnerships do you have? How large is your SWE section? What are some of the overarching goals that you hope to accomplish. The needs statement is really important, and we'll go over more on how to develop a needs statement in the next slide, but this is critical. It helps you understand, it helps you communicate why the work that you're doing is so important for funders to support. So you'll go over the overarching need for more women in positions of leadership throughout the engineering and technology sector. You can highlight the compelling reasons why K-12 outreach is important as you help girls at all stages advance throughout their education in engineering and technology. You can talk about leadership development within collegiate activities. There's a wide variety of compelling reasons why supporting local SWE sections is really important, and developing the needs statement will be critical to any successful case statement that you make, because ultimately it connects the need within the community to the work that you are doing. Of course, you'll also want to go over your section's activities, programs, and goals, include any outreach or professional development programs that you do each year, talk about ongoing leadership development your section provides, note any larger conferences that you are a part of, whether it's a SWE national conference, a SWE local conference, working with SWE's leadership coaching committee, or any other volunteer activities that the section does for to be involved with the larger SWE organization on the whole. Also note on your governance structure and activities. This is an important component for leadership development for many SWE sections, and it's important to highlight and clarify. You also want to develop clear outcomes and note the intended impact of your program. In the second webinar of this series, we'll go over in greater detail how to conduct program measurement within your program, which includes setting SMART goals. And you want to ensure that you emphasize these here. You can see some examples of outcomes, objectives, and impact in the sample proposal that we've included as an attachment to this webinar. Finally, you always want to conclude any request for funding or any case statement with a conclusion, summarizing the key points that you want to make and thanking the donor or reader for taking the time to learn about your program. Once you've developed a case statement, I strongly encourage you to save this document in a area that can be easily accessible by other SWE section members and leaders. Each year, we encourage you to look at the case statement, consider what updates need to be made, and do an overall refresh of the document. When you're developing your needs statement, an important resource is SWE's research site. This contains a lot of up-to-date information on K-12 activities, higher education initiatives, women in D&I, diversity and inclusion issues within the workplace, global trends around women in engineering and technology, along with SWE's research that it has uniquely compiled and published. So as you're developing your needs statement each year, come back to the SWE research site, learn about the updated statistics and underlying reasons that are compelling to funders when they identify how needs in their local community can be met by SWE, and ensure that the information that you're providing in your case statement is always fresh and refresh in order to make the most compelling argument possible for support for your program. Here are a few tips and resources that you'll want to go over. So as you develop your case statement and you review it with your internal leadership group, have someone external to your section review your case statement. This will help ensure that you are sufficiently introducing your work about SWE in your section to a new audience. Remember to include your SWE section logo and employ the correct use of fonts and colors. There's the link here to the SWE section logos and SWE branded templates. And here's a quick overview of the two resources that we've included at this juncture of the presentation: the SWE section case statement template and a SWE sample proposal. Here's a screenshot of the SWE sample proposal. As you can see, the mission of SWE is front and center, along with a history and background of SWE. Throughout this brief sample of our proposal, we also give a compelling needs statement with recent information, go over objectives and goals for a program, describe the program in detail, talk about intended and long-term outcomes, and have a conclusion. You're free to use any of this information in a proposal or case statement that you may be developing. In addition, we've developed this template that you can use to fill out information about your local section. Let's move to how to identify funders in your area. There's several ways that this can happen, and ultimately I encourage any local fundraising entity to become very familiar with the larger employers, foundations, corporations that are working within your area and your local community. Some ways to find these funders are the Foundation Center, Guidestar, Grantsmanship Center, foundation websites, and of course the websites of major employers. The Foundation Center is a paid subscription resource. You may not have immediate access to that. Often it's something that can be accessible through a local library or community fundraising organization. Guidestar is a free resource and will allow you to find out any of the contact information, funding priorities, recent and current grant awards, giving capacity for any private fundraising entity or foundation entity, including corporate philanthropy and local foundations. A really unique way that is often not encountered by individuals who are newer to fundraising activities is doing prospect research through looking at organizations that do similar work to the work that you're doing. To that end, if you have a strong K-12 outreach component of your local section, consider looking around your local community and identifying what other organizations do similar work within the K-12 arena that you do. Go to these foundations or local organizations' websites and look at who is supporting their programs. This can often be pulled from an annual report or a list of supporters on an organization's website. Go then to the first source of support for these organizations. If they list a number of companies or foundations, visit those companies and foundations' websites directly and see if there are giving priorities that match the work that you're doing. Later on, we'll talk a little bit about how to record this sort of prospecting material so that you can conduct various stages of solicitation and getting to understand the fundraising priorities of the establishments on their own. But this is a good place to start when you're doing prospect research. Another important thing to remember is that foundation tax returns show all of their giving within a specific area, and this, while seemingly overwhelming at first, is an excellent resource as you're trying to learn more about funders within your area. Finally, make sure that you understand who the major employers are. Many of them have local giving programs. Frequently, there's a high priority on supporting area initiatives, and understanding who those major employers are and the major philanthropic arms of your local community is important. And visiting these websites and doing searches around your specific area will help you in your initial stages of prospect research. So for example, we'll spend a minute or two on how to use Guidestar. Go to guidestar.org, create a free user login and ID, and then you can search any philanthropic or foundation entity that makes grants. In that search, it will provide you with key contact information for the foundation or corporate philanthropic arm, talk to you about the tax statements that we'll go over on the next slide. The 990, while seemingly complex to someone who hasn't looked at tax returns from private foundations before, is actually a very friendly and accessible resource to anyone who's doing prospect research. For this example, I pulled up the General Mills Foundation that has a lot of work within the K-12 industry. They focus much of their giving within the Minnesota area, but have some national grant making as well. On the first page of the 990, you'll be able to see the total revenue and the total expenses and grant distribution for the foundation at large. This will help you understand if you are working or approaching a fundraising entity that has a significant impact or maybe has a narrower impact and only funds a few select programs each year. Another thing that this will tell you is if the foundation gives out several million or hundreds of millions of dollars, it's more likely that they have a wide and diversified portfolio of fundraising and grant-making activities. If they're only giving out $50,000 to $100,000 a year, you can assume that they're going to be much more selective and rigorous in reviewing any fundraising requests that you give to them. The amount of money given out by a fundraising and grant-making entity should not ultimately prohibit you from approaching them, but it's good to be aware of the total capacity of the foundation or corporate philanthropic arm before you do an initial approach. Downloading the 990s that you can find for free on Guidestar are an important step to this process. Another thing that you can find in the 990 that's very helpful is a statement on all grant-making activities. All foundations, private foundations, are required to list the recipient, purpose of the grant, and the amount that was awarded in their 990 return. When you're going to approach a funder, understanding the types of grants that they've made, the amounts that they've made, and the geographic location that they've made these grants is important information to have as you approach them. So you can see under the recipient name and address, quite a few of these grants were made in Minnesota, but there are other grants throughout the country as well. You can also see that the grant ranges amount vary significantly, from $500,000 to over $1 million. Since the vast majority of these grants are between $5,000 and $40,000, when you approach a funder like this one, the reasonable assumption is that the initial request would be in the smaller range, and with the possibility of a much larger request as you develop the relationship. Knowing the right amount to go and ask a funder about before you establish connection is really vital in any sort of fundraising and prospecting activity. When you identify funders in your area, here are some key questions that you'll want to ask. What programs in your area do similar work that you do? We've touched on this briefly. What are the major companies and foundations that fund programs in your area? What key contacts can you leverage to establish contact with a potential funder? And do the sources you've identified programs that directly align with your mission? Let's touch on item number 3 here. How can you identify key contacts that are associated with a private foundation or philanthropic arm of corporation? Another way to do this is looking at the 990 tax statement, especially if the foundation or corporate philanthropic entity doesn't have a website that lists individuals that are involved with the grant-making arm of the entity. All 990 tax statements show a list of the board of directors and key personnel that are involved with the grant-making of the foundation or corporation. Going through those names and understanding if you have any possible connections is the one strategy that you can leverage in order to identify contacts that you might know. Finally, you really want to make sure that the sources you've identified directly align with your mission. And this is so important that I've created a separate slide for it. You ultimately do not want to chase funding by institutions, foundations, or corporations that are funding programs that you are not doing. This will cause mission drift, and ultimately you'll be involved with a lot of work that isn't fulfilling the core of your local SWE section or the goals of your section members or your section leadership. That is why developing a clear case statement that everyone can agree to and really drives the core of your work and purpose is so important before you start doing any sort of prospecting activity. Once you have a clear case statement and you understand your mission and goals, it'll be much quicker and easier for you to understand the direct alignment between what you want to accomplish and the mission and goals of the funder. Ultimately, the most compelling fundraising pitches are those that have a direct missional alignment. So when you identify funders in your area, how can you evaluate if they have a direct missional alignment? First of all, you want to know if there's geographic preferences. If a foundation that you're looking for supports the specific provide grants in a geographic area that you do not serve, you know that there's not a strong missional alignment. Understand the deadlines for funding opportunities and know if you will have enough time to develop a proposal. I strongly recommend foundation or corporation before submitting any sort of fundraising request. This will help you quickly ascertain if there's a direct missional alignment. So you want to start the process as soon as possible. Even if the deadline is 3 to 6 months away, it can sometimes take several weeks, if not months, in order to establish contact with a foundation or corporation and have a conversation around missional alignment. You'll want to understand the typical grant award amount. This, again, can be found oftentimes on a foundation website or by downloading the 990 from Guidestar for the local charitable entity. Another thing you'll want to understand is if the funder accepts unsolicited grant proposals. Oftentimes, especially with smaller foundations, they do not accept any sort of unsolicited grant proposal. That means that the foundation will come to you and directly request that you submit a proposal to them, and they will not request or respond to any other requests that they did not seek out. One way to approach this situation, if you encounter a funder that you think is a great match for your program, is to send them a letter of inquiry, which we talked about on the first slide of this webinar. The letter of inquiry will present your case statement in clear and compelling terms, but it won't make an ask. You might say, I'm simply writing to let you know about the fundraising or the programmatic activities that we are committed to through our local section. In this letter of inquiry or letter of introduction, you want to make sure that you're clear with how the funder can contact you should they want to solicit a grant request from you or learn more information about your program. To that end, you will want to appoint a point of contact, whether it's someone on the section leadership or within the fundraising activities committee of your local section, to be the point of contact for the letter of inquiry or letter of introduction. Finally, you want to know if the foundation or corporate funder has staff. If they have full-time staff, it's much easier to find them and set up a conversation to discuss any questions that you may have prior to submitting a grant proposal or letter of inquiry. If the foundation or corporation does not have foundation staff, you'll realize that it will be much harder to get a one-on-one conversation with them, and that's when leveraging your contacts and contacts within your section is of critical importance. You can also learn if the foundation or corporate entity has staff by looking at their 990. They are always required to list the highest paid staff individuals for the private foundation. Here are some best practices in approaching funders. Throughout this webinar, doing your homework has been emphasized. You want to ensure that you have a really solid understanding of the funding priorities, deadlines, and guidelines, and giving amounts, and geographic preferences before reaching out to any funder. Once you understand this basic information, try to have a conversation with a funder before you submit a proposal. This can be very simple, just by calling them and asking them if they have a minute or two because you have a question or two about their grant-making priorities and upcoming grant deadlines. When you do get a funder in person or on the phone, make sure that you listen first before you launch into explaining the value and value add of your specific program or local SWE section. Helping them understand that you want to understand their clear priorities and missional alignment will make a much stronger case in the end when you are able to directly connect what they envision their fundraising and grant-making activities need to accomplish with the work that you are doing. Try to identify a common connection. This can't be emphasized enough and will help you get in the door and have an initial conversation or connect your missional alignment more explicitly. Make sure you start the conversation by asking your contact what their funding priorities are. These, of course, are listed oftentimes in the 990s or on the websites for the corporate or foundation entity, but they may be different from what is listed online or in the recent 990. Oftentimes, grant-making priorities change and shift as environmental factors ebb and flow, and what the actual priorities of the fundraising and grant-making entity are may differ than what's listed online. So this is a great first question when you pick up the phone to talk to a new prospective funder. Ask them what their funding priorities are. Another great question is ask your contact what are the most important elements of a successful funding request. Oftentimes they'll give additional information that may not be explicitly listed in a guidelines document that guides grant-making activities. You also want to make sure that you have developed your resources as you are considering your case statement development, researching local grant-making entities within your local community, and contacting funders. We strongly recommend that in the shared area where you keep all of your SWE section documents, so you have a fundraising folder that has these following items. You'll have the case statement that you've developed, along with any previous case statements that leadership has developed in years past. You'll want to keep your federal employee identification number ready. This is vital for any sort of grant-making request. You'll need your 501c3 status letter, any 990 tax filings that you've submitted or your audit, and a working budget for your section and the program in question. Oftentimes, SWE sections are under the fiscal responsibility of a different entity. So I recommend any SWE section leadership, as they're engaging in their fundraising activities, to speak with their fiscal agent to ensure that they have the proper documentation and avenues necessary in order to conduct fundraising activities. Keeping these resources in a shared folder that can be passed on from SWE leadership team to SWE leadership team will build the institutional knowledge for your section and ultimately make your and future fundraising activities much more successful. Prospect tracking. Another document that we've attached with this webinar is a sample prospect tracking sheet. Ultimately, you want to keep it simple and easy as possible in order for you and others who are working on prospect research to identify, document, and share the prospects that you are learning more about. So save, share, and repeat. Cost-effective platforms, as most sections are very well aware of, are Dropbox or Google Drive, where you can share a cloud-based folder that can be easily accessible by you and other leaders within your section. Regardless of the system that you decide to use, the prospect tracking template that we've shared allows you to track the following data. And even if you don't use it, please consider tracking this data as you go about prospect tracking. You want to get the name of the funder, funder deadline, recommended funding amount. Again, this can be found either in the guidelines, on the foundation website, or in the 990. Name of the contact that you want to try to establish a relationship with, their information, a website link to the foundation or corporate entity, and understand the program priorities of the corporate foundation or private entity. We've included the SWE Prospect Tracker template as a download for you. This concludes the Society of Women Engineers Prospect Research, Identifying Funders and Partners for Your Program.